The winter of 1876 brought the harshest cold that Timber Creek had seen in decades, a bitter chill that seeped through the wooden walls of every building and froze the small Colorado mining town into a portrait of ice and desperation. Victoria Calloway stood at the edge of town, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she watched the last stage of the season struggle up the mountain pass, hoping against hope that it carried news from her brother in Denver. At 22, Victoria had seen more than her fair share of hardship. After losing their parents to typhoid 3 years prior, she and her brother had ventured west from Boston seeking a fresh start. Her brother had continued on to Denver for work, leaving Victoria to establish herself in Timber Creek as the local schoolteacher. The position provided her with a modest cabin on the outskirts of town and just enough money to get by, but the isolation of mountain life during winter had begun to wear on her spirits. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The once vibrant emerald wool now faded from years of use. It had belonged to her mother, one of the few keepsakes Victoria had managed to bring west. The delicate fringe at the edges had begun to unravel, but she couldn't bear to part with it until today. As the stagecoach lurched to a stop, Victoria noticed an elderly woman disembarking with great difficulty. The woman, wrapped in clothing clearly inadequate for the mountain winter, trembled violently as she stepped down into the snow. "Madam, are you quite all right?" Victoria approached, concern etched across her features. The older woman looked up with watery eyes. "Just passing through to meet my son in Silverton. I hadn't expected such cold." Victoria hesitated only a moment before unwrapping her precious shawl. "Please, take this. You need it more than I do." "Oh, child, I couldn't possibly," the woman began, but was interrupted by a deep voice from behind them. "That's mighty generous of you, miss." Victoria turned to find herself face to face with a tall man dismounting from a dappled gray horse. His face was partially obscured by a well-worn hat, but his eyes piercing blue against sun-weathered skin caught her attention immediately. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "Xavier Norton," he introduced himself, tipping his hat slightly. "Just arrived from Wyoming Territory." Before Victoria could respond, he had removed his heavy canvas jacket and draped it around the elderly woman's shoulders. Then, to Victoria's surprise, he gently took the shawl from her hands and wrapped it back around her own shoulders, his calloused fingers brushing against her neck. "Keep it forever," he said quietly, his voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. "Something that precious shouldn't be given away, even out of kindness." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than propriety allowed, and Victoria felt a warmth spreading through her chest despite the cold. "I have blankets in my saddlebags, madam," Xavier told the older woman, "and I'm heading to Silverton myself. I'd be honored to ensure you reach your son safely." The elderly woman accepted his offer gratefully, and Xavier helped her toward the town's only hotel where she could rest before continuing her journey. "Thank you, Mr. Norton," Victoria called after him, her fingers unconsciously tracing the fringe of her mother's shawl. He turned back, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Xavier, please. And you are?" "Victoria Calloway, the schoolteacher." "Well, Miss Calloway, I suspect we'll be seeing more of each other. I've taken on work at the Silver Dollar Mine for the winter." With that, he tipped his hat once more and continued on his way, leaving Victoria standing in the snow with an inexplicable flutter in her stomach and her mother's shawl wrapped securely around her shoulders. The next day, Victoria arrived at the one-room schoolhouse earlier than usual, stoking the pot-bellied stove to ward off the pervasive chill before her 12 students arrived. As she arranged primers on the rough-hewn desks, a knock at the door startled her. Xavier Norton stood on the threshold, hat in hand, looking considerably more presentable than he had the previous day. His dark hair was combed back, though a stubborn lock fell across his forehead, and he'd exchanged his trail-worn clothes for a clean shirt and vest. "Mr. Norton," Victoria acknowledged, suddenly conscious of her simple blue dress and hastily pinned hair. "What brings you to the schoolhouse?" He stepped inside, boots leaving damp prints on the wooden floor. "I heard you're in need of firewood. Thought I'd offer my services before heading to the mine." Victoria frowned. "I can't afford to pay for—" "No payment necessary," he interrupted, placing his hat on a nearby hook with surprising familiarity. "Consider it a welcome gesture." Before she could protest further, he had rolled up his sleeves and set to work stacking the split logs he'd brought in his wagon neatly beside the stove. Victoria couldn't help but notice the lean strength in his movements, the efficiency with which he worked. "You've done this before," she observed. Xavier paused, a half-smile playing at his lips. "My mother was a schoolteacher in Montana Territory. I spent many mornings chopping wood for her classroom." "And your father?" A shadow crossed his face. "Killed at Shiloh when I was 8. "I'm sorry," Victoria said softly. "I lost my parents to typhoid 3 years ago." Their eyes met in shared understanding, and for a moment, the schoolroom seemed to shrink around them. "The shawl," Xavier said finally. "It was your mother's." It wasn't a question, but Victoria nodded anyway. "One of the few things I have left of her." He finished stacking the wood and dusted off his hands. "That's why I couldn't let you give it away, no matter how kind the gesture." "How did you know?" "The way you held it. Like it was more than just wool." Xavier retrieved his hat and moved toward the door. "I should get to the mine." The foreman doesn't appreciate tardiness, even from new hires. "Mr. Norton," Victoria called as he reached for the handle. "Thank you." He turned, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "Xavier, please." "And you're welcome, Miss Calloway." "Victoria," she corrected, surprising herself with her forwardness. His smile deepened. "Victoria." As the door closed behind him, Victoria became aware of her quickened pulse and the warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the now roaring stove. The weeks that followed fell into an unexpected pattern. 3 mornings a week, Xavier would arrive at the schoolhouse before dawn with freshly split wood for the stove. Sometimes they would share coffee in comfortable silence as the sun rose over the mountains. Other times, they would talk about books, about the places they'd seen, about the homes they'd left behind. Victoria learned that Xavier had spent the years since the war wandering the Western Territories, working as a ranch hand, a tracker, and occasionally as a scout for the army. He spoke little of those experiences, but the haunted look that sometimes crossed his face told Victoria there were stories he wasn't ready to share. In turn, she told him about Boston, about her dreams of attending university before her parents' deaths had forced her to become practical, about her brother's determination to make a fortune in Denver so they could someday return east. "Do you want to go back?" Xavier asked one morning in late January as they watched snow falling softly outside the schoolhouse windows. Victoria considered the question seriously. "I thought I did. But now, I'm not so certain." "What's changed?" She met his gaze, her heart racing. "Perhaps I'm beginning to see the beauty in this place." They both knew she wasn't talking about the landscape. The comfortable routine was broken one Friday evening when Victoria entered the town's general store to find it buzzing with excitement. A new shipment had arrived despite the winter weather, and among the treasures was a stack of books and recent newspapers from Denver. As Victoria browsed the limited selection, she overheard 2 miners discussing the new man at Silver Dollar. "Norton keeps to himself mostly," one said, his voice lowered but not enough. "But Johnson says he recognized him from somewhere." "Trouble?" asked the second man. "Maybe. Something about a shootout in Cheyenne last year." Victoria's hand froze over a copy of Middlemarch, her heart suddenly pounding. Surely they couldn't be talking about her Xavier. Her Xavier? When had she begun thinking of him that way? "Miss Calloway," called Mr. Gunderson, the storekeeper. "There's a letter come for you on the post wagon." Grateful for the distraction, Victoria collected her brother's letter and hurried back to her cabin, trying to dismiss the miner's conversation as idle gossip. But a seed of doubt had been planted, and she found herself examining everything she knew about Xavier Norton, which, she realized, wasn't as much as she'd thought. Her brother's letter provided no comfort. After pages detailing his success in Denver and plans to move further west to San Francisco, he included a postscript that sent a chill through Victoria's bones. "I've heard reports of a gunslinger named Norton operating in the territories. Be wary of strangers, especially those with mysterious pasts. I worry for your safety in that remote town." That night, Victoria slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of Xavier standing in the street with a smoking gun, his kind eyes turned cold and merciless. The next morning dawned clear and frigid. Victoria wrapped her mother's shawl tightly around her shoulders as she made her way to the schoolhouse, still troubled by what she'd heard. She had just lit the stove when the door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and Xavier, his arms laden with wood. "You're frowning," he observed, setting down his burden. "What's wrong?" Victoria hesitated, torn between her growing feelings and her brother's warning. "I received a letter from my brother yesterday. Good news, I hope?" "He's doing well," she said carefully. "But he mentioned something concerning." Xavier stilled, his expression guarded. "Oh, he warned me about a gunslinger named Norton operating in the territories." Victoria watched his face closely. "Is there something you haven't told me, Xavier?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the stove. Finally, Xavier sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I was hoping to leave that part of my life behind," he said quietly. Victoria's heart sank. "So it's true. Not exactly as your brother probably heard it." Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd come to recognize. "After the war, I worked as a lawman in several territories. Made some enemies. Last year in Cheyenne, I killed a man who was trying to rob the bank. He had friends who've been spreading stories ever since." "You were a lawman?" Victoria asked, relief washing over her. "Deputy Marshal for 3 years in Wyoming Territory." Xavier met her eyes steadily. "I've never shot a man who wasn't trying to kill me or someone else first, Victoria. But I won't pretend my hands are clean." Victoria moved toward him slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because for the first time in years, someone was looking at me like I was just a man, not a gun." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I liked the way you saw me." Without thinking, Victoria reached out and touched his cheek. "I see you, Xavier Norton. All of you." His hand came up to cover hers, warm and calloused. "And what do you see?" "A good man," she said softly. "A man I've come to care for deeply." The confession hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing at once. Xavier's eyes darkened as he slowly leaned forward, giving her every chance to pull away. Instead, Victoria rose on her tiptoes to meet him, their lips coming together in a kiss that sent warmth cascading through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he murmured, though he made no move to release her. "Your students will be arriving soon." Victoria nodded reluctantly. "Will I see you tonight?" "At the Founders' Day dance." "I hadn't planned on attending," Xavier admitted. "Crowds aren't really to my liking these days." "Please," Victoria said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I'd very much like to dance with you." A slow smile spread across his face. "Then how could I possibly refuse?" The schoolhouse had been transformed for the annual Founders' Day celebration. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, desks had been pushed against the walls to create a dance floor, and a small band of local musicians played cheerful tunes in the corner. Victoria stood near the refreshment table in her best dress, a deep blue silk she'd brought from Boston and rarely had occasion to wear, her eyes constantly drifting to the door. "He's not coming, you know," said Harriet Wilson, the wife of the general store owner, following Victoria's gaze. "Men like that don't belong at civilized gatherings." Victoria bristled. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Wilson." The older woman sniffed disapprovingly. "We've all noticed your familiarity with that gunman. It's most inappropriate for a schoolteacher." Before Victoria could defend herself, the door opened, and conversation throughout the room faltered. Xavier stood in the doorway, dressed in a clean black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his dark hair slicked back. But it was the confidence in his stance that truly transformed him. He looked every inch the lawman he'd once been. His eyes found Victoria immediately, and he crossed the room with purposeful strides, ignoring the whispers that followed him. "You came," Victoria breathed, suddenly aware of how rapidly her heart was beating. "I promised to dance," Xavier replied, offering his hand with a slight bow. "May I?" Victoria placed her hand in his without hesitation, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor just as the musicians began a waltz. Xavier's hand settled at her waist, firm but respectful, as he guided her through the steps with unexpected grace. "You dance well for a man who avoids crowds," Victoria observed, conscious of the eyes watching them. "My mother insisted I learn. Said a man should know how to be a gentleman even if he chooses not to be one." His blue eyes crinkled at the corners. "You look beautiful tonight." Victoria flushed with pleasure. "Thank you. You clean up rather nicely yourself." They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, conversation flowing easily between them. By the time the waltz ended, Victoria had forgotten about the disapproving stares and whispers. All that mattered was the man before her and the way he looked at her, as if she were the only person in the room. As the evening progressed, Victoria introduced Xavier to the few townspeople who didn't immediately turn away, including the young schoolmaster from the neighboring settlement who had traveled specifically for the celebration. Xavier was unfailingly polite, though Victoria noticed the way his jaw tightened whenever someone made a point of avoiding them. "Would you like to step outside for some air?" Xavier asked after their third dance, clearly sensing her discomfort at being the center of so much negative attention. Victoria nodded gratefully, and they slipped out onto the schoolhouse porch. The night was crisp and clear, stars blazing overhead in a way they never did in Boston. Victoria's breath formed small clouds in the cold air. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't expect everyone to be so judgmental." Xavier shook his head. "Don't apologize for them. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be." Victoria's voice rose with sudden passion. "They don't even know you." "They know enough," Xavier said, his tone resigned. "A man with a gun and a past. That's all they need to know." Victoria stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest where she could feel his heart beating steadily beneath her palm. "They're wrong about you." Xavier covered her hand with his own. "Victoria," whatever he intended to say was interrupted by a commotion from inside. The music had stopped, and raised voices could be heard through the door. Xavier tensed immediately, his hand instinctively moving to his side where, Victoria realized, a gun would normally be holstered. The door burst open, and the mine foreman stumbled out, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "Norton," he bellowed. "Thought I recognized you. You're the bastard who shot my brother in Laramie." Xavier pushed Victoria gently behind him. "Your brother pulled a knife on a saloon girl," he said evenly. "I gave him a chance to drop it. He chose not to." The foreman spat on the ground. "Always got an excuse, don't you? Well, now you're gonna pay." His hand moved toward his coat. "Don't," Xavier warned, his voice taking on a hard edge Victoria had never heard before. "There are women and children inside." "Then we'll settle this elsewhere," the foreman growled. "Tomorrow at noon. Main Street." "I don't do that anymore," Xavier said firmly. The foreman laughed, an ugly sound. "You don't get a choice. Either meet me tomorrow, or I'll find you when you least expect it. And maybe I'll pay a visit to your schoolteacher first." Xavier moved so quickly Victoria barely saw it happen. One moment he was standing beside her. The next he had the foreman pinned against the wall, forearm pressed against the man's throat. "You go near her, and they won't find enough of you to bury," Xavier said, his voice deadly quiet. "Understand?" The foreman's eyes bulged with fear, but he managed a nod. Xavier released him and stepped back. "Get out of here. Sleep it off." The man slunk away into the darkness, muttering threats under his breath. Victoria stood frozen, trying to reconcile the gentle man who brought her firewood with the dangerous figure she'd just glimpsed. Xavier turned to her, his expression guarded. "I should see you home," he said stiffly. "Xavier, please, Victoria. Let me do this one thing right." The walk to her cabin was completed in silence, the easy companionship of earlier in the evening replaced by a tension that seemed to grow with each step. When they reached her door, Xavier finally spoke. "I'll be gone by morning," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't bring trouble to your door." Victoria felt as if her heart were being torn from her chest. "You can't just leave." "I have to. Men like him don't let go of grudges, and I won't have you caught in the middle." "So you're running away?" Victoria challenged, anger replacing her initial shock. "After everything we've shared?" Xavier's face hardened. "I'm protecting you the only way I know how." "I don't need your protection," she shot back. "I need you." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Xavier closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. "Victoria," he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. In the silence, Victoria made a decision. She stepped forward and kissed him, pouring all her feelings into the gesture, her fear, her anger, but most of all, her love. For a moment, Xavier remained still, and she feared she'd misunderstood everything between them. Then his arms came around her, pulling her closer as he returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Victoria spoke before he could. "Stay? Not for me, but for yourself." Stop running, Xavier. He rested his forehead against hers. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. Then be what you are with me. Victoria took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Face him tomorrow if you must, but face him as the lawman you were, not the gunslinger he wants you to be. Xavier was silent for a long moment. And if I can't be that man anymore? You already are, Victoria insisted. I've seen it every day since you arrived. The conflict in his eyes slowly gave way to resolution. If I stay, there will always be men like him. My past will follow us. Then we'll face it together, Victoria said firmly. But only if you want to stay. Xavier's hand came up to touch her cheek gently. I've never wanted anything more in my life. The admission seemed to cost him something, but once spoken, a weight appeared to lift from his shoulders. He kissed her again, softly this time, a promise rather than a farewell. I should go, he said reluctantly. If I'm to face the foreman tomorrow, I need to do it right. Victoria nodded, understanding. What will you do? What I should have done when I first arrived, Xavier said with newfound determination. Speak to the sheriff, make my past known officially. If the foreman still wants trouble after that, he'll have to go through the law. Victoria watched him walk away into the night, her heart full of both fear and hope. She knew tomorrow could change everything, but for the first time since coming west, she felt as if she'd found something worth fighting for. Dawn broke clear and cold over Timber Creek. Victoria had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous night and imagining what the day might bring. She dressed carefully in a simple green dress, wrapping her mother's shawl around her shoulders before heading into town. The main street was unusually crowded for a Sunday morning. Word of the confrontation had spread, and it seemed every resident had found a reason to be near the center of town as noon approached. Victoria made her way to the sheriff's office, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. She found Xavier inside, deep in conversation with Sheriff Briggs, a gray-haired veteran of the frontier who had maintained order in Timber Creek for nearly a decade. Both men looked up as she entered. Miss Calloway, the sheriff greeted her with a nod. Mr. Norton here has been filling me in on his situation. And? Victoria asked, trying to keep the anxiety from her voice. And I've sent my deputy to bring in Foreman Jenkins. There won't be any street showdown in my town. The sheriff's weathered face creased in a brief smile. Besides, seems Mr. Norton here has credentials that outrank mine. U.S. Marshal's badge carries weight, even if he's not wearing it currently. Victoria turned to Xavier in surprise. Marshal. Former, Xavier clarified. I resigned my commission after Cheyenne. Needed time. Before Victoria could respond, the door opened again, admitting Deputy Carter with a sullen Jenkins in tow. The foreman's bloodshot eyes narrowed when he spotted Xavier. This changes nothing, he spat. You killed my brother. Your brother was wanted in 3 territories, Sheriff Briggs said evenly, placing a stack of wanted posters on his desk. Marshal Norton here was doing his job. Jenkins lunged forward suddenly, but the deputy's firm grip on his arm stopped him short. He was still my blood, and you have a choice right now, Xavier said, his voice calm but authoritative. You can continue this vendetta and end up in prison, or you can accept that your brother made his choices and paid for them. Something in Xavier's tone, compassion beneath the steel, seemed to reach the man. Jenkins slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him. What am I supposed to do? Just forget. No, Xavier said. Remember him as your brother, not as the man I had to stop. That's what I do with the men I've lost. The simple honesty of the statement silenced the room. Jenkins stared at Xavier for a long moment, then gave a single, curt nod. I'll be leaving town anyway, he muttered. Got a job offer in Montana. Then go with a clean slate, Sheriff Briggs advised. No sense carrying old grudges to new places. As Jenkins was let out, Xavier turned to Victoria, relief evident in his eyes. It's over. Is it? She asked quietly. Or will there be another Jenkins in the next town? Xavier took her hands in his. There might be. I can't change my past, Victoria, but I can choose my future. He hesitated, then continued more softly. If you'll have me, I'd like that future to be with you. Victoria's heart soared. Are you proposing Marshal Norton? I believe I am, Miss Calloway, Xavier replied, a smile spreading across his face. Though I had planned something more romantic than the sheriff's office. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat loudly. Well, I suddenly recall some urgent business elsewhere. He grabbed his hat and headed for the door, pausing briefly. For what it's worth, Norton, the school board's been looking for someone to help with the older boys' education. A man with your experience might be just what they need. With that, he departed, leaving Xavier and Victoria alone. A teacher, Victoria asked, raising an eyebrow. Is that something you'd consider? Xavier looked thoughtful. Following in my mother's footsteps? Perhaps. His expression grew serious. But only if I'm not following alone. Victoria stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his neck. You won't be. I accept your proposal, Xavier Norton. His kiss was gentle, filled with promise and a future neither had dared imagine when he first wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and told her to keep it forever. 1 year later, Victoria stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching as Xavier taught their new gelding to accept a saddle. Spring had come early to Timber Creek, bringing wildflowers to the meadow that stretched behind their home. Inside, a half-finished cradle stood in the corner of their bedroom, waiting for the child that would arrive with the autumn. Victoria's hand absently stroked her slightly rounded belly, still hidden beneath her dress, but a constant reminder of the love that had grown between them. On the peg by the door hung her mother's shawl, carefully mended and preserved, a symbol of all they had found in each other. Xavier looked up, sensing her presence, and smiled the open, unguarded smile that had become more frequent in the months since their wedding. He had taken to teaching surprisingly well, his quiet authority and unexpected patience winning over even the most reluctant students. The nightmares that had once plagued him came less often now, and when they did, Victoria was there to remind him that his past did not define his future. Everything all right? He called, securing the cinch on the saddle. Victoria nodded, stepping out into the sunshine. Perfect, she replied, meaning it completely. As she reached him, Xavier pulled her gently into his arms, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her stomach. I never thought I'd have this, he admitted softly. What? A wife? A child? A home? Peace, Xavier said simply. Thank you for showing me the way back to it. Victoria leaned against his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. We found it together. As the mountain breeze stirred the new leaves and carried the scent of pine and possibility, Victoria knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them side by side just as they had since that winter day when a lone cowboy had wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and told her to keep it forever.